Welcome, Alex. Alex Edmans. He's the professor, is a prominent figure in finance and misinformation studies based at London Business School. His influential TED Talk, What to Trust in a Post-Truth World, has reached over 2 million viewers, and he has presented at prestigious forums such as Davos and Google. A former tenured professor at the Wharton School and named MBA Professor of the Year by Poets and Quants in 2021, Alex writes extensively for major publications and is the author of the critically acclaimed book, Grow the Pie. His latest book addresses the pervasive issue of misinformation across various sectors, from politics to personal health. Wow, that's an amazing bios, Alex. And going on to our chair, Richard Foster-Fletcher, whom many of us know, but his introduction is really crucial. As the executive chair of MKAI.org, Richard leads initiatives to equip leaders with the knowledge to ethically harness AI. His work addresses the mitigation of risks like bias and privacy infringements in AI applications. Richard is a renowned speaker and advisor who engages with governments, businesses, and educational institutions to promote ethical technology use. His contributions to data science ethics and the impacts of AI are widely recognized in academic and professional circles. Wow. Back to you, Richard, after the introduction.
Thank you so much, Jaisal. Alex, is there a little bit of scene setting you want to do?
No, I'm happy to immediately go ahead if you're ready.
Yeah, you just asked me for screen sharing, so I just wanted to see if there's anything you wanted to show.
No, as in that I'm going to show my slides, but when I give my talk. But
wonderful. How long do you need for your talk?
I was going to talk for about 25 minutes. Or
great. Let me just check in a few things with you first, and then we can launch into that. So do keep those questions and comments coming in. The book, so congratulations, first of all, on the book. I'll put the link up in the chat in just a moment, but absolutely make sure you get a copy of this. I'll put it up here one more time on my screen. If it's blurred, may contain lies. So we have some AI angles in there, but Alex is basically talking to us, I believe, about the cognitive shortcuts. And it's an absolutely fascinating topic because, I mean, Alex, these are actually the reason that we're here today in a social sense. You know, we've survived millennia as a species primarily because of these incredible social skills. But the downside of them is that we have to take these cognitive shortcuts. Am I right?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. Yeah, so I think the cognitive shortcuts can be helpful in many situations, but shortcuts are shortcuts. And so what I'm trying to highlight is the dangers of these shortcuts.
And so these dangers are here and now and present. So what's changed? I mean, these are the things that kept us alive before. We had to make split-second judgments about life and death and who to trust and whether to fight or flight or whatever else. But now in the business context, they're potentially very harmful. Could you say a little bit more about why that is so?
Yeah, so what has changed? I think just that it's very easy to produce misinformation now. So anybody with a platform can share this on social media. It can be that a regular person starts some conspiracy theory, and if that conspiracy theory feeds into people's biases, then people are going to be willing to lap this up and to share it. And also what's also changes that who is producing information. It is not only reliable sources, but companies will now start releasing their own reports. So the likes of BlackRock and McKinsey are getting involved in research, but their goal might not be scientific inquiry. Their goal might be brand building, and often they release research in order to be marketing.
Yes.
Sorry, there was some background noise there.
Yeah, we'll just manage that. Sorry.
Okay, so it's often marketing, and people don't realize this because people think that these are scientific studies, but they're actually just done for marketing and brand building.
Yes. Okay. And in the book, you do a bit of debunking, don't you?
Yeah. So what I try to do is highlight some of the issues with various types of research.
And one of the books that you mentioned is The Spirit Level, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, that's
correct. How quality is better. Well, I've built a lot of my working premise on that book, so it'll be interesting to explore that later on. And you also take a shot at Malcolm Gladwell, I think, on the 10,000 hours, which I happen to agree with you on as well. So we'll touch on that after your presentation. And then we'll come back around some of the black and white thinking that you want to give us maybe some tips and ideas for how we can overcome. But would it be a great time now to have a look at your prepared comments?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much. So let me just share my slides. So I'm just going to give you an overview of some high level themes of the book, and then that can hopefully then spark the Q&A that the attendees will have. So this is a book about data and statistics and evidence. And for me, this is my life. This is my day job. And for many of you, this is what you're working on as well. But then things changed. This was not my entire life after my son Casper was born. And as I'm sure many of you will have experienced, the birth of a child is an amazing event. But then after we brought him home, I shared the news with some friends. And one of my friends is a father of 3. And he wrote back saying, now it's over. And now it starts. So we had to think about how to look after this little guy. And in particular, we had to think about, well, what to feed him. Now, to us, there was something which was really clear. We would feed him based on only breast milk. Why? Because we'd learned from the National Childbirth Trust, this was a parenting course that we took, that breastfeeding is the only thing that you should be doing. So most of the workshop was about how to look after a child, how to change a nappy, what to do when they're sick, but they gave some sessions on breastfeeding. And while most of this was on how to breastfeed, how to ensure a good latch, they started off by saying, why breastfeed? Because breastfeeding is really tough. It's difficult to do. And so if they could convince you of the benefits, then you could make sure... Sorry, there's just lots of background. If they could convince you of these benefits, then people would make sure that they would persevere, even if things were quite difficult. And so they quoted research from the best sources, such as the World Health Organization, recommending exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months without water or any other fluids. And this was backed up by a lot of research, so we thought this had to be true. But as somebody who deals with data and evidence, I thought, let me not accept this at face value. Let me do some research myself. And so I looked at Google. This was in the days before ChatGPT. And there's many things that breastfeeding could be good for, such as child health, parental health, mother-child bonding. But I thought, let me measure the link between breastfeeding and IQ. And you find a lot of studies which suggest that breastfeeding improves IQ. They're from the BBC, so this is a reliable source. You can scroll down, you're going to find other articles saying this. You can also come back another day and then Google the same thing. And Google will also tell you, again, there is this link between breastfeeding and IQ. So this gave a clear message to my wife and me, which is only breastfeed. That was our plan. If we were to breastfeed him for the first 6 months, he would be cleverer than anybody else in his nursery class based on this evidence. But then, as a famous breastfeeding expert, Mike Tyson, said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. So what was the punching in the face for us? It was that breastfeeding didn't work. So even though we had a good latch, my wife just wasn't producing enough breast milk. You don't in the first few days. So after our son had drained her dry, he still wanted more. And you might think, well, isn't it obvious that you should feed a hungry baby? But it's not obvious when the World Health Organization is saying, don't give anything other than breast milk. We wonder whether we should just let him go hungry. And indeed, often as parents, you don't give your kids what they necessarily want. So I went back to the information that I looked at previously. So I went back to this article, and even though all the articles I found on Google had the same headline, I thought, let's go beyond the headline. So let me click on the article and let's see what it says. And it says exactly the same thing as the headline. Google wasn't doing any fake. They were accurately reporting one statement from the article. But here's the important thing. If you read 2 lines down, it says this: because of the small sample size, we could not confirm the significant difference between the breastfed and bottle-fed groups. So this means that the difference was so small, it could be due to luck and nothing to do with breastfeeding. And it gets worse, because if you look at the top, it tells you about another study on 5,500 children, finding that breastfeeding has no significant effect on intelligence. Now, this was surprising to me, because everybody tells you breast is best. You hear from doctors and nurses and pediatricians that we should use breast milk. So how could this be the case? Because this went against all of the information that I've been told. So number 18 here, there's a reference. Let's click on footnote 18. You get a study published in the British Medical Journal. Now, I'm not a medicine expert, but I thought even this article, I should be able to read. It's 6 pages long, and it's full of a lot of long words, which I don't understand. But I do understand numbers. And so if I look at the table, it compares breastfed versus bottle-fed kids. It finds there's a difference in IQ of nearly 5. That's not major, but it's also not small either if you can add 5 points to your child's IQ just by having a different feeding method. That's something everybody will take. But as the astute of you will notice, there is this word unadjusted. So what does unadjusted mean? What might you adjust for? Well, breastfed and bottle-fed kids, they differ across many dimensions. So breastfeeding is tough. It's difficult to do without family support. So maybe the mothers who are able to breastfeed, they have a supportive partner at home. They might have help around the house. And it could be those factors, not the breast milk, which are leading to the differences in IQ. And so when you control for all of these other factors, once you strip out the differences in IQ which are attributable to things like the mother's education, the mother's IQ, whether the mother smoked, you are left with peanuts. The difference in IQ between breastfed and bottle-fed kids is only 0.5. It's so small, it might be due to luck. And so this is striking. Right, so the idea that we should only feed breast milk, this is something which can guilt trip mothers into thinking, I'm not a good mother if I'm giving anything other than breast milk. Sometimes if you're extremely exhausted, you might think, I need to use breast milk, I can't reach for the bottle. So what did my wife and I do afterwards? We decided to have combination feeding. So we still use breast milk as the first option. There are lots of benefits, such as mother-child bonding, but we would not be afraid to use formula if my wife needed a top-up. My wife needed a break, or our son needed a top-up. So why is this the example that I want to just use as just the opening example here before the Q&A? It's to highlight 4 things which I think are themes of misinformation. First is research is everywhere. So my day job is to review academic papers and to write academic papers. But this is probably not your job. And so I really appreciate you giving up an hour to listen to me when your job is not about scrutinizing academic papers. But what I'm highlighting is even if we don't read academic papers, we are affected by research in our day-to-day lives. When you choose whether to breastfeed or bottle feed your kid, that's being based on research. If you pick up a copy of Women's Health or Men's Fitness or Runner's World, you are acting on the basis of research. Let's say last month you watched the London Marathon. You're inspired. You want to run a marathon yourself. Do I do high intensity interval training or low intensity steady state? That is being based on research. What if you read self-help or self-improvement books? If you want to use the 10,000 hours rule, which Richard asked about, and I'm sure we'll talk about in more detail, that is something which claims to be based on research. Perhaps the best-selling book of the current day, Atomic Habits. If you want to develop atomic habits, should you really listen to that book? Is it based on research? A famous book about 10 years ago said you could develop a 4-hour work week. You could just work for 4 hours a week if you just bought Tim Ferriss's book. Is this research true? Maybe you don't like reading books. Maybe you're using your eyes all the time in your day job. Maybe you like to listen in your spare time. And if you listen to talks, isn't there anything better than a TED Talk? The second most viewed TED Talk of all time claims that if you are in a difficult interpersonal situation, let's start by doing some power poses, like having our arms stretched in a victory salute. Do this before a job interview or public speaking. You'll ace that talk. But that research was hugely debunked. So these things matter. The idea of being discerning with information matters irrespective of what your job is. This is something which we deal with in daily life. The second point is, well, yes, we know about misinformation, but isn't the solution to check the fact? So if people claim that Barack Obama is not a natural-born US citizen, you can just check the facts, look at his birth certificate. But what I'm trying to highlight here is that even if something is 100% accurate, it is still misleading sometimes. So it is 100% true that breastfed participants have higher IQ. This is not a wrong statement. As a government, you can't prosecute somebody for saying this. This is correct. But what is not correct is the implication that it's breastfeeding that leads to the higher IQ. It could be other things going on, like the different backgrounds. So we need to do more than just check whether something is true. We need to make sure the inferences are accurate. But you might think, isn't it easy to check whether the inferences are accurate? Shouldn't we know that correlation is not causation? Shouldn't I know this as a finance professor? And shouldn't I have known to click through and look at what the full study said and get the full picture? But the reason why I didn't do this is something that Richard mentioned in his opening questions, which is the concern with biases. So I am a biased person. I wish I wasn't, but I suffer from biases. And the bias which mattered here was confirmation bias. So this is the idea that people have a view of the world, and if you see some information that confirms that view of the world, we switch off our critical thinking faculties and we accept it uncritically. And why do we know this? We're not bad people. We're not trying to misinform ourselves, but we're human. And as humans, we have a brain and we have the striatum. And when we see something which we like, news that we like, it triggers the striatum to release dopamine. It feels good to see information that confirms what we want to be true. And when you think about bias, you might think, well, this applies to huge things. Like I could be biased for or against gun control or immigration or abortion. But my point here is that even subtle biases can matter. So I'm not a huge breastfeeding advocate, but I am biased. I'm led to believe something natural is better than something man-made. We learn this as kids. We learn to eat natural flavors, not artificial flavors. So when I was given the evidence that breast milk is always better, I accepted it uncritically. So the final point is we need to check everything. So what is the solution to check stuff? And you might think, well, to check everything, is that even possible? Aren't there hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of types of misinformation out there? So one of the reasons I wrote the book was to try and categorize all those types of misinformation into just 4 to make it easy for the reader or the user of information. And this is something that I illustrate in something I call the ladder of misinference. Why I use a ladder is when we start from data and then we form conclusions, we are climbing up the ladder. So the first step, the first mistake we make when climbing up the ladder is we confuse statements with facts. So even if something is stated, it might not be a fact. It may not be accurate. So we saw those Google previews, they were correct, but they were not accurate because they were not giving the full picture. One more serious case in which this has happened is in the opioid epidemic, which has killed millions of people around the world. Why are opioids prescribed so much? Because of some research which claims that addiction is rare. In the New England Journal of Medicine, cited by over 1,500 people, this must be true. Well, let's look at the research. Here it is. That's the first page. Where's the second page, third page, fourth page, fifth page with the tables and the data? There's none. This was a letter to the editor. So without ever even checking, people saw there was a headline in the New England Journal of Medicine. They cited it, claiming there was no concern with addiction. They overprescribed opioids. This is a big concern. And even if the letter was not lying, let's say this was something which is accurate, it just looked at having one narcotic. Maybe one doesn't lead to addiction, but 2 or 3 doses might. And it looks at people in hospital. Well, in hospital, when you're given this in a controlled environment, you're not going to get addicted. But it may be that if you prescribe this to outpatients, there could be a serious problem. So check what you're looking at, but not only check the facts, check the broader context. Is this something where it's a letter, not a study? Is this something only on hospitalized patients? Second part of the ladder, facts are not data. They may not be representative. So what do I mean by this? So let's say you've checked the facts. You know something is 100% accurate. It could still be misleading because it could be a hand-picked example, the exception that does not prove the rule. So let's take the third most viewed TED Talk of all time, by Simon Sinek, the idea that if you have a passion, a purpose, you start with why, you'll be successful. And he backs this up with facts. Apple is successful, undisputable. This is the first $1 trillion company. Wikipedia, in the non-profit sector, hugely successful. They've surpassed the Encyclopedia Britannica as the founding for knowledge. Third, the Wright brothers, hugely successful, the first ever people to launch a flight. They beat Samuel Pierpont Langley, even though he's much richer. But these are just handpicked examples. Even if they are completely true, there could be hundreds of other organizations that started with why and fail, but you're never going to hear about them because they don't support Simon Sinek's case. What you'd want is you want something like a clinical trial. You have some people, you give some a drug, you see how many get better and how many get worse. Others get a placebo, how many get better and how many get worse. Let's compare the two. Importantly, our data does contain people who took the drug and got worse, companies that start with why and fail, but a Simon Sinek book is never going to tell you about them. Also, it could be that the data set contains people who didn't start with why and still succeeded, patients who didn't have the drug but still got better. But again, Simon Sinek never tells you about this. He only tells you about the cases that support his story, even if they're completely accurate. This is misleading. So you might think the solution is to see the full picture, to look at all the data. But this is not a solution because data is not evidence. It may not be conclusive. There could be a correlation without a causation. So what is the difference between data and evidence? Well, we hear the word evidence in a criminal trial. Evidence is only evidence that points to one suspect. It could be that Tom, Dick, or Harry could have committed the crime. And if the evidence suggests that a man committed the crime, that is not evidence because it's consistent with all the suspects. So the big data we had about breastfeeding, that is not evidence because it could be that breastfeeding causes higher child IQ, or it could be that something else, family background, both causes somebody to breastfeed and leads to higher IQ. So then what do we do as a busy person who confronts data and evidence and information? Well, what we need to do is not to use PhDs in statistics, not to use statistical pyrotechnics. So in my book, I don't have a single equation. It's just to use common sense. So how do we trigger the common sense? If you see something you want to be true like this, imagine you had the opposite result. So imagine breastfeeding led to lower IQ. So that feels wrong to us. We know that something which is natural should be good. So try to think about how we would knock it down. We would say, well, maybe the women who are breastfeeding are poor. That's why they can't afford formula. And maybe it's poverty, which is causing the lower IQ. So now that we've alerted ourselves to an alternative suspect, poverty, ask ourselves whether the same explanation might still hold true even if the result is in the direction we want. So this highlights that often we have the discernment within ourselves. We are able to show discernment and ask critical questions, but we only do this when we find a result that we don't like. So by imagining the opposite, I'm encouraging us to exercise the same discernment when there's a study that we do like. Which leads to the fourth and final thing. Evidence is not proof. It may not be universal. So even if evidence is cast iron rock solid, it only applies in that case. If Tom did kill Sarah and Tom was the husband, that doesn't mean in every case when a woman dies, it's always the husband. But a proof is universal. It applies everywhere. And so let's end with the 10,000 hours rule because that's something that Richard mentioned. So Gladwell says that in any kind of field, if you work for 10,000 hours, that will allow you to be successful. But the evidence he cites is evidence on violinists. And so what's true in violin might not be true in chess or neurosurgery. He's claiming a general. So let me wrap up. There's more stuff, but as I said, I'm going to end with the 10,000 hours. So what I'm looking at here. So if we're given a statement, check, is this fact? What was actually said? Is it a letter? Is it a study? What's the broader context? Were they looking at only hospitalized patients? If you're given facts, are they cherry picked? Are you being shown the full picture? Those with the secret source who failed and those without the secret source who succeeded. If we're giving data, Is it evidence? Is there only one possible conclusion? Or are there rival theories, alternative suspects? If we imagine the opposite result, how would we knock it down? And finally, even if the evidence is rock solid, check the context. Is it something which claims to be about neurosurgery, but the evidence is only on violin playing? Okay, so thanks very much. That was just a quick overview. So let me get to the various questions. I think Richard's prepared a lot, and obviously, if you've got some in the audience, I see there's a lot of them there.
Alex, thank you so much on behalf of this group as well for preparing that presentation that you've shared with us today. It's illuminating, and there's been quite a lot of talk recently about the biases in academia and how a lot of these studies can be debunked when you see that, of course, it's vital in your career that you have something interesting, conclusive, worthwhile. Otherwise, what's the point of it? Now, coming to your 10,000 hours comment, I have a personal story about that aligns with what you're saying, is that when I was young, like a few people on this call, like Jerry, I played the drums. And I practiced and I practiced. I had a kit and I was playing every night, and I played in the local orchestra, the local band, and I worked really hard at it, and I had lessons. And I'd played for years and years and years. And I had a beautiful kit. I was very lucky. And then I traveled up to see some family friends. I'm only young. I'm only about 13, 14 at this age. And the son, my friend who I meet with, has just got this new kit about 3 weeks ago. And it's battered. And it's held together with gaffer tape because they didn't have that much money. And he said, yeah, I've just started playing. I said, go on then, play. He picked up his sticks and he played these drums. Remember, he'd only been playing for 3 weeks. And I just thought, damn. I was like, that's how you play the drums. And I knew I could never play the drums like that. We were just simply built differently. And he went on, by the way, to play in some of the biggest orchestras around the world. So I was correct. He was outstandingly brilliant at the drums. And so I think these myths are harmful, just to come back onto topic, Alex, and especially in the West, because we're supposed to be a product of our choices, aren't we? Everybody's got the same opportunity to be as successful as you want to be. The only reason you're not is because you haven't made the best choices. And it's a very harmful myth, I think, that's propagated by, like you're saying, 10,000 hours. Well, you just haven't tried hard enough. You haven't done it for long enough. Are we on the same page with this, Alex?
Yeah, so you might think, why does something like the 10,000 hours idea spread? Because we love to have control of our lives. You like to think that you can do anything you put your mind to. We tell this to our kids. We say practice makes perfect. And so the idea that we have complete freedom is great. And this is an empowering book, because if the book tells you it's just genetics, there's nothing you can do about it. Nobody's going to buy the book. But if you buy the book because the book promises, if you follow my particular plan, you'll be successful, then you're going to get a lot of buyers. And this book was extremely successful. But then the flip side is that if you're not successful, then it was your own fault. And obviously, sometimes you should have personal accountability, and that is important. But the idea here, which is that you can do anything that you want to, this is not necessarily supported by the data.
Yes. Okay. I want to bring Paul in for a comment. Welcome, Paul.
Hello there. I'm in a slightly noisy place, so sorry if there's a bit of background.
That's okay. One thing I'm conscious of today, as we talked to Alex, is that we spend a lot of time reflecting on artificial intelligence. When you're hearing Alex's presentation and some of these comments, what does it bring to light for you around the accelerated risks that we might see from data and AI in what's being described?
Well, I have to say, I find Alex's approach very refreshing and much needed in the AI field. And I guess one of the reasons I'd love to put this to Alex is, for me, there's a rhetoric around AI, Richard, which is that somehow bias is kind of disgusting. And that the main benefit of AI is it's going to reduce the disgusting nature of bias in all too weak human beings. So bias checking, bias filters, and so on. And my own view as a philosopher is that bias is absolutely beautiful, fundamental, and describes the human condition. So human beings express preferences all the time. Some are more or less conscious, preferences for food, preferences for life, and so on. When they're less conscious, they can lead to either benevolent or very damaging behaviors. So we can express a preference for something, it goes into our behavior and good comes for it and everyone's happy. A stand-up comedian can have a bias towards certain kinds of humor and everyone laughs. And the smell is rather good in the comedy. But equally, somebody's preference, if it's not conscious to them in a context, could cause harm to other people because their preference is damaging. But my belief, and this is what I wanted to put to you, Alex, and I'm going kind of back to the Middle Ages around the the word biasm. That biasm is a kind of substance. So human beings express preferences. We're supposed to. It's part of life. In fact, it makes up pretty much all of who we are. The result of preference is bias. Bias isn't in human beings. It's not in the human brain. It is the outcome of preferential behavior that's more or less conscious and more or less damaging. But so I guess the thing I'm asking really is, maybe it's a leading question. Is there a danger that if we locate bias in human behavior and forget the word preference, that we sort of throw out the beauty and the value of bias actually being the outcome of human behavior and not something to be eradicated from the brain, usually by AI?
It's a really good point and a really good challenge. And I've given it quite a few talks. So the book's only been out a couple of weeks, but I've given a few talks. It's just great to have questions like this, which I haven't got before. And it's really illuminating. So I fully agree with what you're saying. I actually disentangle bias and preferences into two separate things. So the preference is what outcome do we want? And it might be that I have a different outcome. I have different goals from you. They're not wrong. They're just my preference. So my preference might be an easy life rather than huge career success and making a lot of money. That is not my bias. That is healthy. We're just different people. We have different objectives. When I talk about bias, it's specifically on how we use information to achieve particular objectives. So when I talk about unbiased use of information, I'm not talking about the preference or the objectives, but if my goal is to achieve that outcome, then am I using the best information available, or am I latching onto something which is correlated and not causation? And I think you're absolutely right, Paul. This is really important for me to emphasize, particularly in future talks, is that often we conflate bias and preferences, and when we're calling somebody biased, they actually have different preferences for us. So if somebody, let's say I was a strong Remainer in the Brexit referendum, if somebody is a Brexiter, I could say, well, they're really biased, but it could be that their goal is not just economic prosperity, it might be sovereignty, it might be these other objectives, and then they're not wrong because they just have a different preferences for me. So I think any bias, when I speak about confirmation bias, it's how we respond to new information. Do we use this information to help us achieve our objective, recognizing that our objective might be different from other people's objective?
Yeah, and I guess I just asked, and do you find, I mean, we're in AI all the time, that one of the biases maybe out there is that bias has become quite dogmatic in the AI field as being seen as a default bad thing?
So certainly, if it's preferences, then it's not. Because that's just how we are, and I think it'd be difficult to make a value judgment that your preferences are wrong and my preferences are right. Secondly, some biases, if they're shortcuts, they can work. So let's say a heuristic could work. It could be that if you are walking on the street and if you see a 15 stone but strong tattooed man, you might cross the street because you might think he could come and beat you up. Now, is that bias? So sometimes you're crossing the street unnecessarily, but sometimes, like statistically, you might be in more danger if encountering somebody of that description than if it was a more elderly citizen. So what I'm trying to highlight here is that there are reasons why we have biases like confirmation bias and black and white thinking, which help us in many cases. But there are particular cases where it might lead to the wrong results. And I'm trying to highlight that sometimes those cases can be important ones. And these are not small things like the opioid example or the breastfeeding example.
Thanks, Paul. And they're weaknesses, aren't they? They're vulnerabilities almost in our system. And I just want to mention, although we've covered it in great detail as an organization and community, but of course, social media and how these weaknesses that we're describing were systematically exploited with algorithms, the black and white thinking, the biases, the wanting something to be true. And then, of course, social media found the opportunity to push us into filter bubbles or echo chambers where that could be reinforced. And that was very powerful. So we've seen some of the dangers, I suppose, with AI, which is the amplification of this and the acceleration of these dangers. In terms of but we have seen a great narrative change in social media that's helped us to become much more aware of that. A lot of people now know what I've just been describing. And there's also been a narrative change around data as well. So it wasn't that long ago. And if actually, I spoke to Richard Thaler, famous author, and even he said at the time, maybe 2 years ago, I'm okay with these large tech companies having access to my data, so long as they're doing something useful with it for me, as long as it's helping me. And that was quite common to hear a few years ago. And now it's less common, and people are more likely to say, I'm not sure I can trust these organizations when they have access to my data. So how's that come about, Alex? Is that part of this, the kind of work that you're describing, where we do confront these biases of what we want to be true, and we do challenge our thinking? And how does that show that it's possible that we're changing our perceptions, like in that area around data privacy?
So I think data privacy and the bias I'm talking about are somewhat different. So I think data privacy is just what organizations doing with your data. I think that's different from how do we respond to information. And I just like just comment on the things that are coming in the chat. So biases are human traits, but if they're human traits that lead us to not using information correctly, then we should be concerned about it. So absolutely, if it's differences in preferences, that is completely fair, and that's not something that we want to eliminate. But if it means that I am going to not pay attention to a particular piece of information because I'm just going to rule it out, then that's something which can lead us to not achieving our objective in the most efficient way.
Thank you. You mentioned some of the comments. So Jason, perhaps this would be in a moment if you could just call out some of the great comments that we're seeing in the chat.
Absolutely. I have few comments, and let's go through those. So I think coming back to breastfeeding and the IQ associated to it, we had a comment from Alex, and he said, IQ wouldn't be the major benefit of breastfeeding for most people. It's bonding, immune system, physical health for both mother and baby. I would never have even considered IQ as a benefit. So that's just a comment from somebody who feels differently.
No, but this is an important point. But if you look at the studies, as I mentioned at the start, there are these other benefits. But if you take those other benefits as well, and you control for those other factors, a lot of those benefits go away as well. So those are benefits that actually don't necessarily come from the breast milk itself, but from these underlying causes. So I picked up IQ as one example. But if you do this, and so the Emily Osterberg on Crib Sheet, she actually systematically takes all of the claimed outcomes. Now, actually, some of those outcomes still survive after those controls. So maybe I think she starts with 15, and after you do the controls, about 11 go away and 4 still stay. So there are some benefits will still survive the controls, but they're far less extensive than one might thought. So it's not as black and white as people would argue.
Thanks, Alex, for adding that. Marcus has said, I think he has given a suggestion or an idea of how he looks at this. I quite like looking or searching for what isn't there, but maybe should be, often seems to give more information compared to the published facts. And then Paul has added, bias is a form of preference. Preference is often beautiful. There's nothing wrong with bias per se. Bias is only important to control if the preferential behavior subconsciously is somehow harmful to self or others. Reducing bias as a compulsive default behavior is actually a bias in itself and harmful to self or others. And then Dennis has added, bias is a coined word in layman language and not technical, but Marisa feels otherwise, that bias that can cause discrimination is problematic because we understand that technically how confirmation bias can be added to the data as well. And now there is one more comment that has come in. One of the problems is that models, and in particular single factor models, will never be able to represent or replicate reality. Yet, because it carries the scientific or research flag or label, humans tend to conclude, oh, it must be true then. I think these are some of the comments that have come in, Richard. We have few questions. If you let me, if we have the time, then we'll add that.
There was also, I think, a good question from Nicholas Strong. Could I speak to that? So Nicholas asked, can I ask how you approach cultural variations? I think this is really important, Nicholas. So often we take a study, and the study is done on a small set of people, and then we claim a universal proof. We extrapolate from this, and we believe it applies to all cultures. So often we have these studies which are done on weird people. So you might think I'm quite offensive calling these people weird. This stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So those are where a lot of the research funding is in the US. We find something which is true in the US, and then we claim that this is going to be existing everywhere. So there's various games which people play in psychological settings, like looking at your approach to fairness. And because of some conclusions which are made, people think this is true everywhere in the world. And let's go back to one parenting example, because I started with that. I'm sure many of you will know this famous marshmallow test, where you give a kid a marshmallow and you say, well, if you were to not eat this marshmallow and wait for 15 minutes, I will give you a second marshmallow. And that apparently predicts success in kids. And this is so important. This is such a famous finding that it's put into school curriculums. Even Sesame Street had the Cookie Monster teaching kids on the importance of delaying gratification. But this was done on Stanford University children. So they're not only Western, but they're rich, they're educated, they're kids of very wealthy parents. In another setting, then people can't actually trust the researcher when they say they're going to give you a second marshmallow later. Why? In some cultures, it may well be there's just not enough food on the table. And if your brother tells you, hey, give me your cookie, I'm going to give you two back, you just don't believe him. Why? Because those are settings where food is less abundant. So in fact, what is it which is causing the outcome? It's not the fact that the children are delaying gratification and they're patient, but children from a tougher environment to begin with are the children who are more likely to eat the marshmallow now, because they've just been brought up in an environment where you should eat whatever food is on the table because it might not be there tomorrow. So I think Nicola's point is really important. We can't over extrapolate from evidence to proof. That was the last step of the ladder. A proof is something which is universal.
And of course, we want diversity, Alex. I remember when I was karting a few years ago and I kept banging the back of the car to the guy in front of me, one of the friends that I was with, that I just met. And afterwards, we compared notes. And I said to him, what's your job? And he said, I'm a pharmacist. He said, what's yours? I said, I work in the commercial sector. I thought, well, that's why we're hitting each other every corner. You're slowing down and I'm speeding up. But we need both types in society. We can't just have people who want to delay gratification. We need others that jump in and try things and take risks before they're ready. And that's all part of the wonderful soup of people that make up what we need. So there's nothing inherently wrong, I think, in saying, I'm just going to grab this first marshmallow and I'm going to get on with it because I want to make things happen today, even though they might be better tomorrow. So, Paul, question? Comments?
Yeah, I guess I think I'm just concerned that if we traumatize bias as a bad thing per se, with drawings of the brain too much, we end up with Generation Z, and there's lots of academic kind of particularly social science type data around this, where this is the generation that fears to say yes or no. They are the culture of maybe. When you ask them what they think, they say, I'm not sure. They say maybe because they're terrified that if they come down on one side or the other, they're going to fall into the disease of bias. And I think that's really sad. And I think AI is exacerbating it if it treats bias as a kind of medical type disease to be eradicated.
And I think we see the harms of this. I saw an article from The Economist where they put a questionnaire in front of some young people. And one of the questions was, do you believe that the Holocaust was a myth? And then they reported that 20% of young people believe the Holocaust was a myth, which again, absolute clearly nonsense. First of all, I mean, who are these people and why would that mean anything ever? And second of all, why would you ask a question where you put the words Holocaust and myth in the same question? You're obviously going to prompt some people to say yes, because it's a terrible, stupid question in the first place, designed to get that kind of output. So then you can go, oh my God, young people think the Holocaust didn't happen. It doesn't take much, Alex, does it?
No, exactly, and I think often things will just have particular connotations with them. And so, what I'm talking about when we want to absorb information is to look at the information. We obviously start with a belief, and that's fine. But what we want to do is, it's called Bayesian updating. So there was a comment earlier, well, bias is often used in a loose way, and it's not technical. And I agree with Dennis's point. So what would the technical definition be of a fair reaction to information? Is to take our earlier belief, we would respond to this in what's known as Bayesian updating, and then we'll have a new belief. And so this doesn't mean that everybody ends up with the same belief after looking at data, because we all start from different places. So even if we saw the same data, we're not going to all reach the same outcome. So absolutely, we want to still have this diversity. But what I am saying is that when we see the information, we will take the information based on its accuracy, rather than immediately dismissing it because we don't want it to be true, or immediately latching onto it because we do want to be true.
We've got about 10 minutes left, Alex. I want to give you a couple of the prepared questions. So as we mentioned in your book, you critically examine the misinformation that can be perpetuated by well-known figures, institutions, and so on. Personally, what sort of challenges have you faced when confronting widely accepted yet potentially flawed truths within particularly the academic and potentially business communities?
Thank you very much for raising this. And let me just give a concrete example. So there is a lot of studies out there by McKinsey and BlackRock claiming that more diverse organizations will perform better. So they claim there's conclusive proof that diversity improves financial performance. Unfortunately, these studies are extremely flimsy, so they make even more basic errors than the ones I highlighted in my talk. I'm not going to go through them, but they're on the website maycontainlies.com about the concerns that there are. And so one of the concerns from speaking out is people often conflate the objective with the approach. So if you say, oh, these DEI studies are problematic, people think you must be anti-DEI, you must be racist or sexist, when actually maybe I am supportive of DEI, but I think the better way to look at this is not to reduce somebody to just their gender and ethnicity, because that suggests that if you're a white male, you can never add to diversity. When you can have a different way of thinking. You could be the first in your family to ever go to university. You could be from a different regional background. There's a lot of regional inequality in the UK. Just by having a different accent, people might already make inferences. So then my own research finds that when you look at a more holistic measure of diversity, which is not just gender and ethnicity, that does lead to better financial performance. But if I didn't have that other research, I might have much more pushback than I would do. If I was a white male, I would face more pushback. And I think this is a problem. I think people should respond to what I say based on the evidence, not the color of my skin. So I've received a little less pushback just because I'm an ethnic minority and I know that they know that I'm not anti-diversity, and because I have a lot of pro-diversity research. But I think we should be able and have the freedom to highlight critiques in studies, even if we are from a particular demographic group, and even if we don't have other research to support other benefits of diversity.
And how do you balance skepticism and cynicism in your work?
I think this is a great question. And I think what I'm trying to encourage is discernment and healthy skepticism rather than cynicism. And these, there's obviously a fine line between this. And so I think with cynicism, you might be questioning people's objectives or questioning the whole movement. When I wrote my articles about diversity, I'm saying, well, I'm only speaking about this particular study. I'm not saying that McKinsey is a bad management consulting firm. And I'm not saying there's problems with DEI in general. It's just limited to this particular study. And even if this study doesn't hold water, it could be that absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. And I think here, whether the phrase in football is you play the man, not the ball. Here, I'm actually trying to play the ball and not the man. I'm going to be trying to focus on the particular study rather than the people behind it.
Thank you.
Nicola asked a question about the diversity research. So there are some indeed in the book. So the leading example of chapter 5 is on diversity, but it's relatively brief. So let me just give in the chat where there is more work on it. So what I did on the website is, because there's lots of things which were in the book but got cut just because of space, or number two, which came out after the book was published, I have tried to put them on the website so people can read them. So here is just a collection of articles specifically on diversity, but on the website more generally, there is some of this just broader type of research on things like the Stanford Marshmallow Study. That was something that got cut from the book, but is on the website.
I did go onto your website. I'm so sorry, I forgot to mention that you've got a website for the book. So that was great. It's a great resource. So thank you for reminding me on that. A few minutes left. Public policy and democracy. I want to talk to you for a moment about that. With misinformation identified as such a significant threat to democracy and public policy, what sort of policy changes do you have in mind, or could you recommend to governments, international bodies that might safeguard the integrity of our information? I know that's a big question, but some thoughts on that maybe.
It's a big question, but it's a great question. I think it's a great question because the answer is not obvious. So often people say, shouldn't it be the government who's out there to ban misinformation? Or shouldn't it be the publisher's job to not publish books with misinformation? Or should universities not kick out professors who produce misinformation? That is true in an ideal world, but I don't think it's practically realistic, because these forms of misinformation can be really subtle. So as I highlighted earlier, it could be that you have a statement which is 100% true, but it's the inferences which are misleading. So if I go back to this statement here, as a government, you could never prosecute anybody for saying this. This is true. It's just the implications that flow from this are misleading. And even if they went on to say, we believe this is because breastfeeding causes higher IQ, you can't prosecute that. That's one interpretation of the data. And in keeping with like Paul's comments earlier, we can allow for people to have their interpretation. So you can't ban somebody for having an interpretation that you disagree with. So this is why I think the onus needs to be on the individual. And so that's the reason why I wrote the book, is to empower any reader to think about the ladder, to think about the different ways in which we can be misinformed, so that this is something that you can do yourself. So then
that statement is leading, though, isn't it, Alex? It is suggestive, isn't it?
Well, it could be, but is it any more suggestive than saying countries that begin with U have higher GDP, like the United States and United Kingdom? People would not then say, if we are Somalia, let's call ourselves United Somalia, and then we're going to have higher income. So this is just a statement about what the data finds. And it might be due to my bias. I thought that this was leading. So then I think the role of public policy is to encourage the critical thinking that I've just gone through in our short time together. So I think this can be taught towards children. So we now have literacy. We have AI literacy. I think the IT literacy we're trying to teach towards kids. And I think it's not unrealistic to think about statistical literacy. Now, often people think, well, statistics, don't we learn this in A level when we're 16 or 17? But I haven't presented a single equation today. All I'm saying statistical literacy is about is thinking about alternative explanations for the same data. So with kids, we read murder mysteries to them, where it's often not the most obvious person who committed the crime. They know to look beyond the obvious. And similarly, if we see some data, a correlation, think about, are there non-obvious explanations? And I also put a few brain teasers in the book, which are ways in which we can encourage kids to think about alternative explanations. So I do think, like, for policy, rather than regulating misinformation, is to give people the tools to spot it and to make sure that they're not falling for it.
Yeah, thank you. Vital this year with all the elections coming up. My last prepared question, and we've touched on it, but it's more of a summary in that sense as well, because you propose various strategies to combat misinformation. It's pretty much been the focus of our whole topic today. Could you elaborate, summarize some of the most effective approaches individuals can adopt to discern truth in the age of misinformation? And as a second part to that, there's a lot of technologists obviously on this call. What role do you see technology playing in aiding these efforts without exacerbating the problem?
Thanks, Richard. I think the tool of imagine the opposite is useful. Why? Because this harnesses our discernment. It makes sure that we are applying the same discernment to something that we like as something we don't like. I think more broadly, just to try to look for different viewpoints on contentious issues. So, in the Brexit referendum, I was extremely pro-Remain, and I thought that anybody who supported Brexit has to be uninformed or xenophobic. So then I forced myself to go to some talks by Brexiters, and I realised they were very logical. So even if I didn't agree with the conclusion, I could see there was a logic to how they reached their conclusion. It was like some really illuminating talks out there that I saw, which I was just embarrassed afterwards at how narrow-minded I had been about this issue just being one-sided. I still came down on Remain, but I realised that this was not as open and shut an issue as I had been led to believe. Then what is the role of AI out there? I think the role could be useful. So as you highlighted, Richard, when you looked at ChatGPT on this breastfeeding question, you got a different answer to what I got in Google, because I looked at Google before the age of ChatGPT. So the idea here is that if indeed generative AI can look out there and can find the scientific consensus, so they're not just swayed by one paper, then this will help us. And this will hopefully avoid the issue that you can always find one paper to support whatever you want to support. So if you want to believe that vaccination leads to autism, you can quote Andrew Wakefield's paper, but maybe ChatGPT would find that this paper was debunked and actually scientific consensus is something quite different.
I'm with you. And numerous times by Google search, hoping to find an article that will reinforce my view on something, for sure. And statistically, just to reinforce your point, statistically, we are living in a simulation. There's no doubt about that if you look at the maths. But I don't believe that we are inside a computer program. I counter the statistics in that particular area. Alex, we've come to 13:59 here in the UK. Very conscious of your important time. Huge thanks for many things. For one, for writing another brilliant book, and we continue to follow your own journey and story and support you any way that we can. Of course, for spending some time with us and being so full of your normal energy and positivity that we've seen from you before and hope to see again. So thank you for what you do, and thank you for your time today, Alex.
Well, and thank you for your time, and thank you to everybody for giving up an hour to listen to my views on this, and thank you to you, Richard, and Jaisal for hosting.